The stagecoach was a rattling cage of iron and pine, and by the time it groaned to a halt at the edge of Blackwood Creek, Clara felt as though her very bones had been shaken loose. The dust of the Montana Territory was a fine, pale powder that coated her Sunday best, turning her navy traveling suit into a ghost of its former self. As the driver tossed her single, battered valise into the dirt and tipped his hat with a hurried grunt, Clara stood alone. The silence that rushed in to fill the space where the horses' hooves had been was deafening. It was a vast, hollow quiet that echoed off the jagged teeth of the Rocky Mountains, which loomed over the valley like ancient sentinels. She took a breath, and the air was sharp, thinner and colder than the humid, salt-kissed breezes of her home in Virginia. Before her stood the ranch house. It was a fortress of weathered cedar and fieldstone, built with more concern for survival than for beauty. It looked like a place where a person could disappear and never be found again. Then the front door creaked open. Silas Vance stepped onto the porch. He was exactly as his letters had suggested, a man of few words and immense presence. He was broad-shouldered, clad in a work-worn canvas coat and denim that had seen better days. His face was a map of hard winters and long summers under a high sun, his eyes a piercing, guarded blue. He didn't rush down the steps to greet her. He didn't offer a smile or a hand. He simply stood there, silhouetted against the dimming light of the foyer, watching her with a stillness that made Clara's pulse trip. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice cracking. She cleared her throat, trying to summon the poise she had practiced for 3 weeks. "I'm Clara Evans. We have an arrangement." Silas didn't answer immediately. He descended the stairs with a heavy, deliberate gait. He stopped 6 feet away, his shadow stretching long and dark across the dry grass, until it touched the hem of her skirt. He looked at her small valise, then up at her face, which was pale from exhaustion and framed by stray copper hairs that had escaped her bonnet. "The stage is early," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air. "I suppose it is," Clara replied, clutching her reticule against her stomach. "But I am here, and I am ready to begin my duties. I know the letters were brief, but I am a hard worker. Silas, I can cook, I can mend, and I don't mind the isolation." The sun was dipping lower now, retreating behind the peaks and casting the valley into a bruised indigo twilight. The temperature dropped instantly, the kind of cold that bit through fabric and settled in the marrow. Clara shivered, looking toward the dark mouth of the front door. She imagined a warm hearth, a chair, and perhaps a cup of tea to settle the trembling in her limbs. But Silas didn't move toward the house. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his vest and produced a heavy, iron key. He turned back to the porch, climbed the steps, and inserted the key into the lock. With a sharp, metallic clack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet yard, he turned it. He pulled the door shut, tested the handle to ensure it was fast, and dropped the key back into his pocket. Clara froze. The blood seemed to drain from her head, leaving her lightheaded. "Mr. Vance?" she asked, her voice rising in pitch. "What are you doing?" "The house is closed for the night," Silas said, his back still turned to her. He didn't sound angry. He sounded final. "Closed?" Clara stepped forward, her boots crunching on the gravel. "But I don't understand. I've traveled from the coast. I have no money left for a return trip, and there isn't another town for 20 miles. You can't mean to leave me out here." Silas turned around, his expression unreadable in the deepening gloom. He leaned against one of the porch pillars, crossing his arms over his chest. He didn't offer an explanation. He simply watched her, his silence a wall she couldn't climb. Panic, hot and jagged, began to claw at Clara's throat. She looked at the darkening horizon. She could hear the first faint yips of coyotes in the distance, a lonely hunting sound that made her skin crawl. The wind began to pick up, whistling through the eaves of the house, and the high pines that bordered the property. To her, the locked door felt like a death sentence, a cruel rejection from a man who had promised her a new life in his letters. "Please," she whispered, her pride dissolving into desperation. She dropped her valise, the heavy thud punctuating her fear. "If I have offended you, or if you've changed your mind about the marriage, just tell me. But don't leave me to the elements. I'll work for my keep, I swear it. I don't need a bed in the house. I don't need a fire." She turned her head toward the looming silhouette of the barn, a massive timber structure located 50 yards away. It smelled of dry grain and old leather, and while it was cold, it was at least a shelter. "I can sleep in the barn," she begged, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. I'll find a corner in the hayloft. I won't make a sound. I won't even come near the house until you summon me. Just, please don't leave me out here in the dark. I am a stranger in this country, and I am afraid." She looked at him, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white. She was prepared for him to scoff, or perhaps to walk away and leave her to find her own way to the hay. She expected the coldness of a man who viewed a mail order, bride, as nothing more than a piece of livestock that had arrived in poor condition. Silas stepped off the porch again, moving into the space where she stood. He loomed over her, his presence overwhelming. He looked at the barn, then back at the house he had just locked so securely. The wind whipped his coat around his legs. "No," he said, the word short and sharp. "No?" Clara gasped, a sob, finally breaking through her composure. "You won't even let me sleep with the animals? Where am I supposed to go? Do you intend for me to freeze in the yard?" She felt the world spinning. The journey, the hunger, and now this final inexplicable cruelty were too much. She reached out blindly for the porch railing to steady herself, her eyes closing as she prepared for the worst. She had risked everything on a dream of the West, and it seemed the West was going to break her before her first night was through. Silas didn't move to comfort her, but his voice changed. The hardness didn't vanish, but a strange, hidden note of something else, perhaps a rough sort of protectiveness, crept in. "You're not sleeping in a barn, Clara Evans," he said, his voice closer now. "And you're not sleeping in that house tonight either. There's a reason the door is locked, though you're too quick to think the worst of a man." He reached out not to touch her but to pick up her valise. He swung it up as if it weighed nothing at all and began walking away from the main house, heading toward a small cluster of trees where a faint, orange glow was just beginning to flicker through the branches. Clara stood paralyzed for a moment, her breath hitching in her chest as she watched Silas's broad back retreat into the deepening shadows. The wind moaned through the tall grass, a lonely sound that seemed to mock her confusion. He hadn't looked back to see if she was following. He simply moved with a steady, sure-footed grace toward a dense thicket of lodgepole pines and silver-barked aspen trees, left with no other choice but to follow or be swallowed by the mountain night. Clara gathered her heavy skirts and hurried after him, her boots tripping over the uneven, rocky soil. As they rounded the bend of the tree line, the harsh, imposing silhouette of the main ranch house vanished, replaced by something entirely unexpected. Tucked away in a natural alcove of stone and evergreen was a small, stout cabin. It was built of the same cedar as the main house, but it possessed a softness the larger structure lacked. Curtains of cream-colored lace hung in the windows, and from the stone chimney, a plume of fragrant pinon smoke drifted lazily toward the stars. The windows glowed with a deep, honeyed light that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of a hidden fire. Silas reached the heavy oak door and pushed it open. He didn't step inside immediately. Instead, he set her valise down just inside the threshold and stepped back, carving out a space for her to enter. The transition from the biting, predatory cold of the Montana night to the interior of the cabin was like being wrapped in a warm wool blanket. "Go on," Silas said, his voice less of a rumble now and more of a quiet hum. Clara stepped over the threshold, her eyes wide as she took in the room. It was a single large space, but it had been outfitted with a level of care that stole the air from her lungs. A small iron stove sat in the corner, radiating a steady, comforting heat. On the hearth, a heavy cast-iron pot simmered, the scent of slow-cooked beef, rosemary, and root vegetables filling the air. A loaf of crusty bread sat on the scarred pine table, wrapped in a clean linen cloth to keep it warm. Her gaze drifted to the far wall where a bed waited. It wasn't the rough rope-slung cot she had expected. It was a sturdy frame piled high with a feather, mattress and topped with a quilt, made of intricate star patterns, in shades of indigo and gold. Beside the bed, a small washstand held a porcelain basin and a pitcher, and next to it sat a single hand-carved chair with a sheepskin draped over the back. "I don't understand," Clara whispered, her voice trembling not from cold, but from a sudden, overwhelming rush of relief. She turned back to find Silas still standing in the doorway, the moonlight catching the silver at his temples. "You locked the house. You said no to the barn. I thought you meant to send me away." Silas leaned his shoulder against the door frame, his thumbs hooked into his belt. He looked down at his boots for a second, a flicker of something like embarrassment crossing his rugged features. "I'm a man of few words, Clara, always have been. My letters likely didn't prepare you for a man who lacks a silver tongue, but I'm not a cruel man." He gestured vaguely back toward the main house, hidden now by the trees. I spent the last 3 days oiling the floors. In the big house with a mix of, linseed and turpentine. It's a foul smell that gets into a person's lungs and stays there. It'll be 3 days more before it's fit for a lady to breathe. I couldn't have you in there. And as for the barn, he paused, his blue eyes narrowing slightly as they met hers. A man who asks a woman to cross half a continent to build a life with him has no business putting her in the hay with the horses. You aren't livestock, Clara, you're my wife. Or you will be come Sunday when the circuit rider passes through. Clara moved toward the table, her fingers brushing the back of the hand-carved chair. The wood was smooth, sanded down with a devotion that spoke of hours of labor. You did all of this? The curtains, the quilt. The stew? The quilt was my mother's, Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. The rest? Well, a man gets lonely in a place this big. He starts to imagine what a home should look like if it had a heart in it. I figured you'd be tired. I figured you'd want a place of your own for a few days, a place where you could lock the door from the inside and feel safe until, you decided if you liked the look of me, well, enough to share a roof. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a second key, smaller and brighter than the one he'd used on the main house. He stepped forward and placed it on the edge of the table. That fits this door, he said. There's enough wood in the box for the night, and I'll be back at dawn to check the livestock. You eat, you sleep. You've had a hard road, and you're home now. Clara looked at the key, then up at the man who had seemed so terrifyingly cold only moments ago. She saw the calluses on his hands and the weariness in his eyes. But she also saw a profound, quiet respect that she hadn't expected to find in the wilds of the frontier. He wasn't the romantic poet she might have dreamed of as a girl, but he was something better. He was a provider. He was a man who saw a need and met it with silent action rather than empty promises. Thank you, Silas, she said. And for the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach, she smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but it transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of her exhaustion. Silas blinked, seemingly caught off guard by the warmth of her expression. He touched the brim of his hat, a sharp, jerky movement. Don't thank me yet. The winters here are long and the work is harder than anything you've known. But you won't ever have to beg for a place to sleep. Not while I'm drawing breath. He stepped back out into the night, pulling the door shut behind him. Clara heard his heavy footsteps receding, followed by the distant, rhythmic sound of him chopping a bit more wood for his own cold hearth back at the main house. She walked to the window and pulled back the lace curtain just an inch. She watched the silhouette of his lantern as he walked away, a small point of light against the vast, terrifying darkness of the Montana wilderness. She realized then that the lock on the big house hadn't been a barrier to keep her out, but a promise of the quality of life he intended to give her. Turning back to the warm room, Clara picked up the ladle. The steam from the stew hit her face, smelling of salt and earth and safety. She sat in the hand-carved chair, felt the softness of the sheepskin against her back, and for the first time in years, she felt the tension leave her shoulders. She was 1,000 miles from everything she knew, standing in a cabin built by a stranger, but as she took her first bite of the warm bread, she knew she wasn't a guest. She was the mistress of Blackwood Creek, and she would never have to look at the barn as a refuge again.